The simple answer is it cannot. And I don't think that's accidental, because I don't see much evidence that Mr. Netanyahu and his government are interested in peace of any kind. They're interested right now in exploiting what they consider to be their strategic superiority that results in large part from the unconditional backing they presumably are going to get from us.
Does the IDF have strategic superiority? Even if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump said, "Don't worry, we're with you"?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, there's nobody else in the region that really has an air force that can possibly match the Israelis in terms of either technology or performance. You'd have to turn to European states, Russia, perhaps China. I don't think the Turkish Air Force is in the same category. But as we both know, there has been a paradigm shift in warfare. We live in the age of missiles and precision strike and ISR dominance overhead and around the world. Those things are not necessarily entirely in Israeli hands. They certainly have no monopoly on it. So I think it's dangerous to do what they've done. But right at the moment, that seems to be designed to provoke the war that Mr. Netanyahu and his supporters want.
Tell me if this is a fair summary of where things stand. The IDF is exhausted. It has failed to eliminate Hamas. It has failed to control Gaza. It doesn't want to fight any more wars. It's largely a reservist military. If all of that or most of that is true, are they in any shape to go into Lebanon?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. But remember, when you talk about the Israeli Defense Force, yes, you're right. It's essentially a large version of the U.S. Army National Guard. These are citizen soldiers. You say reservists. I think that's accurate. They have sustained a lot of casualties. There are all sorts of numbers going around. Obviously, nobody on either side of the equation right now in the region has any interest in telling the truth. But the Israeli ground force, I think, has the expectation that the Israeli Defense Force's Air Force will strike decisive blows that will make their progress on the ground easier in southern Lebanon than might otherwise be. And I've mentioned before, I think that they're quite prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons in southern Lebanon.
Does the Iranian military have sufficient drones and missiles and other projectiles with which to cause grievous injury to the Israeli military and the Israeli state?
Oh, yes. I don't think there's any question about that. And what's really, truly dangerous at this point is that a lot of the Israeli population in the north, as well as in the south, has been withdrawn into central Israel, which means that you now have a higher concentration of population with the kind of density that presents your opponent with an opportunity to kill large numbers of Israelis. So yeah, I think that the Iranians have plenty of missiles, really, which is what you're talking about, not just drones, to the point where they could exhaust any air defenses and do enormous damage. Now, of course, the question is, will the Israelis wait for that? This goes into a discussion of preemptive warfare. The Israelis have done that before. It's not possible, depending upon what they decide to do in South Lebanon, that they strike first and hardest.
Colonel, do we know who killed the Druze, the 16 Druze teenage soccer players in the Golan Heights? Does it make any sense that Hezbollah would have killed its own children?
No, obviously that's not the case. And I think that increasingly is obvious. Was it an Iron Dome fragment, or was it the fragment of a Hezbollah missile that had been struck by an Iron Dome anti-missile? We don't know. I'm sure people on the ground that have inspected the wreckage can tell. But there was certainly no deliberate attempt on the part of Hezbollah to strike anybody in that particular area in the Golan Heights.
Yet the Israelis will use it as an excuse to expand war. Do you think some sort of a deal was cut by Netanyahu after his speech and in a back room, which gave him the self-confidence to expand a war that he alone cannot win and that he must know that he alone cannot win? I'm sorry for the long-winded question.
Well, as I think I said a few weeks ago, that was one of the reasons for the trip. Everybody likes to point to the fact that Mr. Netanyahu wanted to strengthen his political position at home by signaling that he is still in charge in Washington. Well, that may be true, but being in charge in Washington is of no use unless you can extract something for it. He was in Washington to extract the support of the United States armed forces in the event that he becomes embroiled in a war with Hezbollah as well as Iran. And I think he got it. I mean, I don't know what the provisions were, but I think he's got it. And we're certainly prepared to fly strikes in support of the IDF. I wouldn't be surprised if we have strike packages in the Middle West, bombers and so forth, ready to fly in that direction as well. So again, whatever we do will be air and missile oriented. What you will not see, we've discussed this before, is the arrival of large numbers of ground troops, simply because we don't have them to send.
When you say air and missile, do you mean manned air? Do you mean pilots who could be shot down?
Yes, absolutely. I think that you can expect that we'll have certainly naval air, in other words, carrier-based air.
Right.
And as I said before, you could fly bombers from the continental United States. Whether or not we're prepared to employ Air Force elements from bases in the region, that's a question I can't answer. I would presume yes. Now, one of the places that we will not use, I'm quite certain, is Turkey, because the Turks have really become enraged over what has happened in the region. And Mr. Erdogan, I think, finally, after listening to his National Defense Council, finally decided to speak publicly and warn that if the Israelis go into southern Lebanon, that could be a trigger for the introduction of Turkish military power into the operation.
Colonel, is this a serious threat for Turkish ground troops to enter Israel?
Well, let's back up a little bit and understand that to this point, Erdogan has turned out to be something of a blowhard.
Right.
And oil has continued to move through Turkey into Israel to fuel Israeli military power. So I think we have to look carefully at whether or not something has changed. And I think that the something that's changed is not what's happening in Palestine. Because if he felt compelled to do something, he could have done something a long time ago. It's the possibility that Lebanon is destroyed in a major war with Israel. That would provoke massive exodus of people out of Lebanon, which of course is what the Israelis would like to see. But I don't think the Turks are willing to take any more refugees. They've already got a couple of million on their hands. I think that's the real question. What will they do? Well, he can put the fleet to sea. He can act decisively on Cyprus to ensure he's got a secure base there that he can use. And there's nothing to stop him from committing Turkish ground forces. But the problem for him is to move those forces through Syria to Israel, which is where they would have to go. And the Israelis obviously have perfect visibility over Syria and can do a lot of damage to his forces if they try that. So you're talking about a very complex operation if he's actually going to challenge the Israelis in Lebanon. It's not just Lebanon, it's going to involve the whole region.
Let's go back to your comment a few moments ago about the use of American naval-based air power. Can the Iranians, can Hezbollah sink an American aircraft carrier?
I think it could be done, but I think we need to keep something in mind. We can place those carriers far enough out of range that they could potentially launch aircraft against targets in Lebanon and do so without fear of losing the carrier. Now, I don't know what the exact ranges are. They certainly can range to the Eastern Mediterranean with the missiles that they have. They are precise, and they will have the benefit of satellite-based guidance and support, intelligence, and so forth. But one of the things that people don't understand about carriers is sinking it is not the principal challenge of the carrier. What you really want to do is damage the flight deck. If you damage the flight deck, you put the carrier out of business. It doesn't matter what the carrier does at that point, it can't launch aircraft. In addition to that, if you can damage the carrier such that it ends up dead in the water, that's even better, because then other ships will come to its aid, and then you have a much better target array and the opportunity to do even more damage. I'm sure all of these things are being carefully considered.
Colonel, what does Israel accomplish other than a PR victory by these targeted assassinations? Isn't it like whack-a-mole? I mean, you assassinate one leader and another one, maybe younger, maybe more passionate, maybe more fierce in his opposition, will replace him?
Well, this was the argument against killing General Soleimani, who headed the Revolutionary Guard Corps. He was killed while he was visiting in Iraq. Some people next to him were killed who were high-ranking Iraqi militia leaders. We decided to do that, I think, really because Mr. Netanyahu insisted upon it. And ultimately, President Trump bent to the will of the Senate and other Israeli supporters. I think it probably cheered everybody up in Israel. They thought they'd won a great victory. Now, I'm asking you, is there any evidence that killing Soleimani has made any difference to the growth, development, and expansion of Iranian military power?
None that I know of.
So you've answered your own question. These assassination missions don't have the desired effect. If anything, they tend to strengthen resolve and opposition against you. So no, I don't think it makes any sense, other than to signal we're really not interested in a peace deal that doesn't meet our demands. And our demands are everybody in Gaza leaves or is killed. And ultimately, we want to do something similar in Palestine. And oh, by the way, if you're south of the Litani River in Hezbollah, you're going to be destroyed. And I think that's the message they're sending. So it's not going to change anything except to make a war almost inevitable.
Does Israel care that the ICJ ruled that its occupation of the Golan Heights and the West Bank is contrary to international law?
No, absolutely not. The thing to keep in mind is this: when those wars ended, it made a great deal of sense for the Israelis to hold on to the Golan Heights. I don't know if you've ever been there, but if you go there, you understand strategically, it's like a sloping hill that rushes from Damascus down to Israel, and then all of a sudden you have this great rise, which we call the Golan Heights, in front of you, and on one side you have mountains, on the other side you have low hills. So it's a very strategically commanding position. If I were an Israeli, I would never give it up. The problem that Israel has now is that they've provoked this larger war. They've attracted attention to themselves, and they put themselves in the unfortunate position of being demonized by virtually everybody in the world except us.
Does Netanyahu, as far as you understand, recognize the danger of attacking Hezbollah and likely bringing Iran into the fray? And does he fear that behind Iran might be Vladimir Putin?
Well, the answer to the first question is absolutely yes. The Israelis know this. They know that Hezbollah will be the toughest fight of their lives, which is why I think that they would be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons against Hezbollah. And that will do a lot of damage. Now, consider that many of the Hezbollah fighters and their capabilities are below ground. They're not obviously on the surface. Can they withstand that kind of detonation? I don't know. I can't evaluate that. I suspect in some areas, yes, and in other areas, no. But that's the sort of preparation, or its equivalent in conventional terms, that you will see before any IDF ground forces go in to theoretically clean out whatever remains. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, I think that's another issue for Mr. Netanyahu with the United States. I'm sure he knows that if he attacks Hezbollah along the lines that I'm describing, and I think that's what would happen, Iran will definitely enter the fray. He has not got, and neither do we, by the way, enough air defense capability to stop most of what would be thrown at Israel. So Israel will very definitely take serious losses, both human and infrastructure. At that point, the question is, what do they do towards Iran? And they may decide that the use of a nuclear weapon is now something that they can justify, and they may try to use that against Iran. If that were to happen, it strikes me as a near certainty that Russia, and probably also the Chinese with the Russians, potentially other nations, the Pakistanis, and I think at that point, even the Turks, who have held their fire for a long time, would all feel justified in turning on Israel. And if we decide that we're going to intervene in this sort of thing, they will confront us with the reality that they will fight us.
What is a tactical nuclear weapon? Most people, when they think of nuclear weapons, have an image of Nagasaki or Hiroshima. I would imagine we're talking about something far less than that.
Well, usually, but not always, we refer to it as something less than 5 kilotons. What does a 5 kiloton nuclear weapon do? If we look at Washington, D.C., and a 5 kiloton nuclear weapon were used on the White House, certainly everything within a 4 to 5 mile radius would be destroyed. But you would leave the rest of Washington largely intact, as opposed to the kind of megatonnage that an intercontinental ballistic missile would deliver. So I think that's the sort of thing that you could conceivably witness in southern Lebanon.
Colonel, switching gears, Chris, would you put up the B-roll that you just texted me about? Did this surprise you at all, Colonel? These are Russian and Chinese jets flying within a few miles of Alaska?
No. Why would we? Why would we be surprised? From the very beginning, I and many others have warned of Russia's capability to escalate horizontally. And Putin has said as much, straightforward way by saying, look, you're coming into our backyard, you're moving into Ukraine, which is the equivalent of Mexico for our purposes. You're building a hostile army. Potentially you want to place missiles there. And you don't think that we can do something similar to you? Well, you're wrong. And so we've already seen this. We saw it with the arrival of just one Soviet nuclear attack submarine in Cuba and some vessels, but they're the tip of an iceberg. We have missile boats, Russian missile boats, in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Our boats are out there trying to chase them, keep track of them, maintain contact with them. It's not the surface vessels per se that we worry about, it's the submarines. The surface vessels are really almost dinosaurs in today's world because they're easy targets. And they have to be so far away from you to survive that they probably don't make much difference. So it's really the submarines that are an issue. Now, you've also got North Korea. North Korea has never been a Chinese satellite. It has always been a Soviet and now a Russian satellite or colony. All of the missile technology that the North Koreans have gotten comes from Russia. It started in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. Soviet scientists went there to earn money, and they were paid handsomely and provided whatever they want in return for which they could build these missiles. Now, North Korea has a substantial nuclear capability, warhead production capability, as well as missiles. That's only gotten stronger because whenever we attempt to threaten Russia, Russia reaches to North Korea and says, it's time for you to wake up and get to work. North Korea is a permanent catalyst for conflict in the region. The Chinese dislike them intensely. Obviously, the South Koreans don't like it. The Japanese don't like it. And then you turn to what you just described. These patrols now with the Chinese and the Russians are sending a signal. To attack one of us is to attack both of us. They're serious. We need to take it seriously.
I wonder if Secretaries Blinken and Austin do take it seriously, Colonel.
Well, I think in the Department of Defense, when you go into the Joint Staff at the top of the services, there are real concerns. I know that this General Brown, who is the chairman, in a sort of fit of bravado, told everyone that in a war with China, we would definitely win. Well, first of all, we need to define what is meant by the war. And secondly, we need to define winning. There aren't going to be any winners if the Chinese and we escalate to the nuclear level. And the assumption that our air power is invincible, invulnerable, and immune is simply untrue. We haven't flown against any integrated air defenses, Russian or Chinese or otherwise. We may get a chance now, finally, if we end up fighting with the Iranians and potentially against the Turks. I hope not. But there's a lot of bravado right now, but beneath the surface, people are much more realistic. Remember, we can't produce missiles and rockets fast enough to keep up with the demand in war. The truth is that within a week, at best, most of our missile stocks would be exhausted. And that's the problem. We're not prepped to do anything for any length of time, whereas Russia has now built a substantial capability that will last for months, if not years. And I think that